Hi everyone, this is Fashion Knowledge and my name is Bata Vilcek. I am a Berlin-based critical fashion practitioner and I work across education, research, and strategy. I lecture on fashion, design, and digital cultures, and I run a consultancy and research laboratory called Unfolding Strategies. In each episode, together with my students and fellow researchers and practitioners, we discuss the fashion's most urgent issues and try to reimagine the socially just, sustainable, and digital fashion futures. Okay, hi, welcome everybody. Today our guest is Imad Kabayel, and thank you for joining us, Imad.
Thank you.
Imad is a Berlin-based designer, educator, and researcher, specializing in identity representation and bilingual visual communication. We met for the first time, I think, in 2019, as I was working on a curriculum for a dual city MA program in social design, which was an outcome of a partnership between two schools in Berlin and Beirut. And as Imad is from Beirut and his work evolves around design and context, it became obvious that he should be a part of the program we've been creating. And he still is actually now. In his practice, he does both. So he does visual and theoretical work, which means that his practice is very complex and multifaceted. So on one hand, he can make, a poster, campaign, but also a workshop or write a theoretical text. He is currently pursuing a PhD in ethnography at Humboldt University in Berlin. And he's also part of a Consult Middle East, a consultancy that supports companies, agencies, and institutions in not spreading the Orientalist stereotypes and misrepresentation. And fashion and Orientalism have a very long past. And one of the most classic examples here would be the Parisian Roaring Twenties, where everything that came from somewhere between Russia and Japan was back then considered Oriental and exotic, and later appropriated, used, and inspiration for fashion design. And I think it's important to mention that fashion is a very vital part of the culture. It feeds from it and it contributes and shapes it at the same time. And today we're in the middle of those debates, very important debates on diversity, cultural appropriation, and decolonizing of fashion practices. And we're only learning how to respect, understand, not to misrepresent, and not to tokenize people, their bodies, stories, values, and places they come with. So as a system, fashion has this power to not only tell people what to do with their bodies, but also give them or take away their stories, meaning, and context. So this is what we will discuss today, as Imad is an expert in identity representation and self-Orientalism in art design. And maybe before we start unpacking such terms as identity representation and self-Orientalism, because they're quite dense and big, so I hope Imad will tell us, how you kind of use them and how you interpret them and how we can actually apply them to and learn from them in context of fashion. I would like to ask you if we should say Middle East or Swana, as in Southwest Asian, North African. What do you think is better?
First, thank you, Beata. Starting with a really big question. I mean, the official answer is that Middle East is a colonial term. It really begs the question, it is Middle and East to what exactly? And the answer geographically is Europe. So Middle East is not really a representation of any geographical area, but in relation to European imperialism. Therefore, in academic context, or even, let's make it pop as well, to use Swana, because it is the official or geographic term for Southwest Asia and North Africa. So that's what Swana means. And but I'm also one of the people who really like discussions to happen, as we say in Berlin, Späti discussions. I'm all in favor for using Middle East without necessarily having to write a thesis on it. So whatever rocks your boat, as long as we know what we're talking about.
Good. I think I just also wanted to ask this question because I think it kind of starts and situates, I think, tone of this conversation in the right way. So yeah, how come this is what you do? Can you tell us, maybe in your own words, not in my lengthy introduction words, what is that you do?
What I do is an intersection. So I do design work, graphic design work to be more specific, which is my training. But within that training, when I went to do my master's, I wanted to to do a research on, back then the term was identity, because back then I didn't know what that term can unpack. And of course, starting from my own backyard and my own history coming from Lebanon, we have a complex relation with identity. It can be very dense in terms of we were colonized by the French, but we also had a civil war that really was splitting the country in two. We have 19 different religious sects in Lebanon. Within Christianity and within Islam, we have a lot of different small subgroups, and that makes local identities in Lebanon. And I urge you to also use those terms in plural. So identities, histories, in general, memories, because there is no one. And in Lebanon specifically, we come from that plurality. Again, if we see it in a bigger scope, the Arab-speaking region as well, Swana as well, we mostly talk about plurality. And I wanted to see how and why in design we reproduce kind of colonial visions, whether in fashion or in graphic design or in film or in gaming. We have a lot of those. So I started the work on that back then, and I wanted to know, why we keep doing that. And within that research, I built a whole, kind of a library on those representations, problematic representations, and different discourses. And I still work on that, but from an ethnographic perspective, and that means in easy terms, field work. So I am doing field work in the context of the different Arab memories in Berlin, specifically in Sonnenallee. So that's what I do.
Okay, great, thank you. And what do you, how do you see this plurality being applied, for example, to fashion? And could you give us some example of that?
Usually it's the opposite. So plurality is the reality, and fashion does the opposite, which is usually packing that plurality in a sort of mainstream representation, because fashion is a direct design discipline with a product, with a usable product, and of course it has other purposes. Of course, it can be an artistic expression, but we're talking about mainstream fashion or mass production, and it has to do with the idea of making those instant, quick links. So you want something Arab, I will make it gold. You want something for the Arab world, we'll make it cover you from top to bottom. So fashion reacts to this idea of plurality in a very, let's call it erasure. Fashion erases plurality for the sake of commercial appeal. That's what I think. We can discuss that as well.
Yeah, I think it's curious because we very often when I ask people to define what is, so for me, the answer to this question from social psychological perspective is because the world is complex and we need to simplify things, but also with simplifying complexity and cutting down, there's also things that result out of it. So this is where we are now, because we've been cutting corners and also perpetuating things without considering how others feel about that and how to respond to that, because it was imposed on them. But when we think about fashion and what it is, very often people, and I do that exercise quite a lot with students or with people working in the fashion industry, that they have to define fashion, and they very often say it's means of expressing yourself. So if it's a means of expressing yourself, but at the same time, it's a way to, reduce complexity. It's quite interesting because that means that we're only expressing ourselves through reduced means. I'm not in favor of this definition of that fashion is about self-expression. I always personally see it more as a way of kind of belonging to a certain group, but that's also a way of serving. So I think it's more conformist gesture rather than this creative outburst, because we all are almost dressed the same as we go on the street if we go right now. So so that's very interesting, this mix between expressiveness and expressing your identity combined with this reductionism.
In that sense, I invite everyone to really go a step beyond the self-expression into structures. So through that process, let's say it's self-expression, what kind of structures are we creating, sustaining, reproducing, and also to understand the idea of simplification or order as an idea that is highly colonial. So before colonialism, we were multiple genders. We were not the binaries we know now. We were always about complexity and always about difference. And I think we need to go back to that idea if we want to do any self-expression or self-representation work, whether in fashion or not. That highlights difference as an anti-colonial or a decolonial practice. It's important. I think nowadays we have to rethink simplification as a mandate.
So how can it be done? How can we even start doing this? Because for me, this also comes from this, in fashion, comes from this origin of a mood board as a very powerful tool where everything can be collaged together, mashed up, and you create this patchwork of different visual elements purely for their aesthetics. And this is something that you, as you went to a art and design school, you were trained to do. I work with students who are also trained to do that. So this is something that actually favors form over its meaning, its heritage, its origin, its complexity. This is what it does. And this is something that's very much embedded in fashion work, either if it's being a fashion student or a lecturer, or designer, or a stylist, or a strategist. So how do you think this could be done?
Yeah, the how is a really important question, but also let's start from the idea of there is no how-to kit to answer that or to do that, but there are steps. Or there are maybe suggestions. One of the things could be, in practical terms, to always go beyond the image. It's really important. If we're talking about a mood board, a dress, an artifact, it's always important to go the step beyond. So in our memories, I will give an example in that sense. The black and white scarf that a lot of us know as the Palestinian kafiyeh, and a lot of us wear. It actually became a huge thing, I think in 2006 or 2008, when Guesquière for Balenciaga put it on Paris Fashion Week. And since then, it became a huge hit, and we see it at Topshop, and we see it at Zara, and so on. And then Chanel Cruise Collection did a version of it to represent Dubai. I mean, what is the relation? I don't know. There is no relation because it should represent Palestine. But that scarf itself, if we go beyond the pattern, we unveil a lot of political connotations. That scarf comes from a fisherman tradition. That's why the pattern is like this. And then it became a symbol of Palestinian resistance against Israeli occupation. And this is a really crucial design object, because once you remove the politics from that object, you're contributing to enforcing settler colonialism. So you're kind of removing history as well. This is how important something like that is. And maybe that's the extreme, but you can apply that same principle of going beyond the image. Do your homework, consult a local, work in groups, go do the historical part of the work and the field part of the work. And I think better answers will come up. You might end up doing a shirt at the end, and that's also okay, as long as the start is on solid research grounds. I think that's in a nutshell.
Yeah, I totally, in that sense, with the teaching and the work I do, I totally agree with you. But it's interesting that you're bringing up the kafiyeh as an example. I had a student presenting about that particular topic and about its tradition and heritage, I think a week ago. It was a very interesting presentation. It was a master's student in MA Sustainability in Fashion and Creative Industries. And she decided to talk about it as we were discussing decolonial fashions and post-colonial inquiry in fashion in general. And she decided to talk about it because she is from Middle East, from Swana region, and she saw that one Berlin brand, Lala Berlin, is using it. And she was very kind of triggered by it. She thought, oh, this is a great example of a cultural appropriation. But then it came out in the comments that actually one of the people who's a, I don't know if owner or the main designers from the brand is actually from Middle East, and therefore kind of believes that they are, as a brand, celebrating it for doing it. And I'm curious, if this is, what do you think of it and how we could call it another way? Is this could be an example of self-orientalism?
Yes, this is what I want to say. I'm not talking about the brand itself because I don't know the story, but this is a classical example of self-orientalism in the sense of this kind of, in easier words, it's representing for the Western eye. So you basically take how you were represented, internalize it, believe it, and start producing the same. So this idea of celebrating an object without maybe bringing to the forefront its history, or histories in plural as well, can be problematic. So the notion here is not whether you're Arab or not, to say you can use the kafiyya or not. It is about using the kafiyya without its politics. This is what matters, or at least in my opinion, this is how you can distinguish appropriation from, it's also a simplistic way to say it, appropriation from appreciation. The key is to look for engagement. The engagement comes from politics, from political structures. So we have to look at that. Does it come without the politics? Is there no mention of occupation? Are we not mentioning where that come from? Are we selling it, again, structures? How much? Who produced it? How much are we selling it for? Who is it designed for? It's really problematic to appropriate, also at the level of class, appropriate an artifact coming from quote unquote the lower classes and then selling it to the Prenzlauer Berg audiences is again problematic, even if you're Arab, even if you're political. So it's important to think about this whole thing as a structure within an intersectional framework. Yeah, so it's very entangled, it's very complex, but there are ways.
And is there something that you're working with in your PhD research with Sonnenallee in Berlin?
Not necessarily, because what I'm working on has more to do with internal Arab negotiations of memories, space, conflict, gender as well. So it has less to do with designed objects or self-representation. I went a bit, I diverged a bit, but again, I think that the idea of negotiating memories can tap into Orientalism or self-Orientalism, because we see it a lot in migrant streets where there is an exaggeration of any identity markers, and we can talk about design here as well. There's an over-exaggeration of Arabness, whatever that means, but that has other reasons that doesn't necessarily relate specifically to design, but more to dynamics of intergenerational memory, of memory transferal. So you always see that generations of migrants construct their own memories of home, and then they reproduce it in different ways. And of course, this can be an Orientalist reproduction, though my initial research in design has to do with designers at home reproducing own culture, not in migration. It's a bit different.
I was thinking about myself, how I do, for example, what is self-Orientalism to me as a Polish woman living in Berlin, working in fashion and education. And I started thinking about #PolishGirl. I don't know if you are aware of this phenomenon. So #PolishGirl is a very popular hashtag on Instagram, used probably at first predominantly by Polish women. But what is interesting in terms of number is that this hashtag has now been used about 60 million times, whereas hashtag, I don't know, Russian girl has been 5.6 million, or German girl in Germany has much more people living in it than Poland, 1.9 million times. So there's kind of specific phenomenon, and if you look at it, there is something gluing together those representation of women. And I also used to use it in an ironic way. Nevertheless, I did. So I was thinking, if actually prescribing to some kind of, is it like some kind of way of expressing yourself and your style and also belonging, that in the end, could this also be an example of that? What do you think?
It is definitely an example of like exaggerating a negative stereotype. It doesn't have to do with Orientalism, but it's the same principle of like taking an attribute that was used to exaggerate something negative and then reproducing it and doing more of it. But and that's very related as well to female representations. I mean, in Orientalism, the discourse, we're talking about Orientalism, post-Orientalism, and Neo-Orientalism before we talk about self-Orientalism. And in a nutshell, what happened to representation of women is really important in line of what you're saying, because in Orientalism, the discourse, we were always seeing those visuals of Arab women or Oriental women in this case as unveiled. So before a certain period, they were naked, they were dancers. It was a bit like Jasmine of Aladdin. So there was a lot of skin, a lot of belly dance, and a lot of seduction, hypersexualized. And then 9/11 happened, and after 9/11, we went into Neo-Orientalism. In Neo-Orientalism, the opposite happened. So we started hyperveiling. So then the Arab woman became this, the burqa figure, black from head to toe, which is one type of Arab women, but not necessarily, I mean, I don't have to say it, but it's not necessarily representative. So I also would say that the representation of women as a stereotype also comes from a political tradition. I would say also in post-Soviet countries or in ex-communist countries, one can look at that politically as well. But it's not my area of research, so yeah.
And if we would come back to fashion, like, were there kind of any cases, I don't know, from your perspective that you remember that's actually very, like, I don't know, intrigued you? Is there kind of any fashion related example that you could give us?
Yeah, I can maybe talk about two. There's a book that is that's called The Secret Life of Syrian Lingerie. And it's a book by Malou Halassa and Rana Salam. It's more like a visual research about lingerie shops in Syria, but it's a research that kind of makes fun of it, makes fun of like the lingerie of the lower classes, in other words. And of course, it might seem fun to many. It is also like very eccentric, very weird examples. And I interviewed the writers about it, and kind of it's a fine line between representing the fact that Arab women or Syrian women in this sense are sexual beings like all women, but also this kind of hypothesis in of itself trying to prove that Arab women are sexual beings is also like stemming from a colonial thought that they are not. And the other example, I mean, those are invitations to look at the examples critically, not necessarily that they only represent this. Another example could be a collection by Zaid Farouki. It's called Revival in 2016. Zaid is a Jordanian, I think, designer based in Dubai, and he kind of flipped, you know, the Arab, the Emirati garment that men wear, the white garment with the headwear and the black ring on the head. Zaid flipped that and did a similar interpretation, but for women. So it's a play on gender in that sense. Those are some examples that one can look at as both extremes, either progressive or problematic. So, and I think the answer lies on that spectrum in between, like always. Yeah.
And would you like to see more of such kind of, I don't know, approaches to fashion or in design in general, or are you expecting to see more of them? I'm shifting now on this line more towards the ones that you consider progressive?
I mean, some people, I mean, nowadays we're at an age of this Instagram era where things are quick. Like, for example, you see a lot of representation in, I don't know, there's a video clip of Katy Perry called Dark Horse. You see a lot of Egyptian symbolism. There's also, we're at an age where like you have to be inclusive in representation. An ad we talked about privately was of Klarna. It's called, it's an ad showing a veiled woman of color, fashionably veiled, let's say, because that veil would be problematic for a lot of communities, wearing green, and then it says, weil grün deine Farbe ist. And green traditionally is the color of Islam. So it's a bit like, did you mean it? Did you not mean it? So I would like to see more representation for sure and more visibility, but I'm one of the people who think of visibility as a double-edged sword, because visibility alone can be counterproductive. Visibility that is contextual, political, and researched, so stemming from research, can be very beneficial. So I want to see nuance. I want to see a lot of nuance. I want to see critical representations in fashion, in visual arts, in film, in music. A lot of the in-betweens. Usually the answers are in the in-betweens. I don't want to see a total rejection of something in favor of another. But I want to see nuanced approaches to people being plural and having histories, and yeah.
Yeah, I would also love to see that, and I hope we will see more of that. But could you, if you were able to kind of say, what do you mean by critical representation? What do you mean by that? What is a critical representation?
In easier words, it's a representation that critiques stereotypical ones. Yeah. So, for example, if we think of stereotypical representation of the Arab woman, you would say probably dark skin, probably veiled, probably having 5 kids. Again, a lot of those stereotypes. And I'm not saying that the way to critique that is to show like the totally opposite in that sense. I refuse to talk about a binary, but in that sense, like a woman rejecting or like unveiling, or there's a lot of that in mainstream culture. There's a lot of like in drag culture, for example, you talk a lot about unveiling, like a drag queen in a burqa, and then bam, she's in a swimsuit. So this is an exaggerated way, but a critical representation would be one that seeks plurality and that seeks something against the grain, something against the mainstream. And the grain, when we say against the grain is usually colonial, male, and heteronormative. So by critical, I mean the opposite of those as a first step. And then we go into the in-betweens.
Before our conversation, I shared with you a video. It's an ad that's been hunting me on Instagram. It's a Nike ad. It's a maternity ad where a lot of various, very, very different in many ways women, but most of them very, very pregnant, and I'm talking like 8-9 months pregnant, are exercising, which could be for some people already quite conservative, that you're weightlifting at the gym or running when you are just literally about to pop. And some of them are Muslim women, they're wearing headscarves. What did you think? If this is going against the grain, is this a critical representation to you?
In some ways, yes, but we have to also think about it contextually. I go back to this idea of a structure. We have to think of it as, what are you selling? Who's your audience? Where are you producing? Yeah, who are you targeting again? So it's we have to question the whole structure. It isn't really whether you represent people of color, pregnant women, normalizing any shape or form, normalizing a lot of people or bodies who weren't traditionally represented in fashion or media. I would again call for questioning this performative criticality in a way, because it could be performative, but it could have structural implications. Again, Nike isn't a charity, it's a brand. And we also have to be realistic at that level. Otherwise, brands become even more performative. So once we expect Nike to, I don't know, solve world hunger, we're at fault in this case, because brands are created with a capitalist background. So we have to be realistic at that sense and do work that looks more into the structures behind the brand and sustainability, identity, representation, but also labor. That's a notion that I really want to bring to the forefront, because not a lot of people talk about it. Understanding design or fashion or any discipline in on that spectrum as a form of labor, not a form of performative charity in this sense. So we have to look at the labor structures behind that campaign. So how did they pay, who they paid, who's getting benefits from, where is it produced, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I would even say, you know, who designs those garments and who creates those garments. And I'm very happy that you're talking about labor. One of my students also introduced me to two fantastic images. One is an image of Jacquemus, a French brand, of a team of Jacquemus, of a designer team, where, well, everybody is just super, super, super as pale as me and as white as possible. But then the whole kind of collection and all the models are, you know, people of color. And this was so, it was such a contrast. And it really raises the question, you know, how you can tokenize people, how you can tokenize where they're from, how they look, because you're not very interested in the end who they are. You just want to tokenize this kind of context that they have. And then this is this very performative act. So I think definitely to kind of, you know, leave with some takeaways from what we discuss is that research is very powerful and really important, looking at things in the context, and also thinking about fashion not only in terms of the visual representation, but actually what is behind it and how labor is shaped and structured.
Exactly. Yeah. Sometimes, you know, that zoom out you see in movies where like you're taking a photo, but then you zoom out to the whole set. This is a takeaway, I think, from today's, to see the set, the people on the set, the ones taking the photo, the ones paying, the ones signing, more than the model at the end.
Yeah, we need to look at behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you, Imad, so much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you for inviting me, Beat.